Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special event. Can you make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent? We're live streaming tonight's event, so hello to our web viewers. If you want to join in the conversation in social media, the hashtag is RSA Smith. Now, housekeeping notice is over. It's my very great pleasure to introduce this evening's event, which is organised with the Environment Agency. It's a great pleasure to welcome Lord Chris Smith, the agency's chairman. Nearing the end of his 6-year term as chairman, Lord Smith calls for a new policy importance for environmental issues and concern. What can be done to re-energise the discussion, engage the public, and bring a new consensus behind the need for action? I could, of course, introduce Chris to you at length in terms of his illustrious career, but let's get straight to the chase. He's going to speak for 25 minutes. I'm going to ask him a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up for you to join in the conversation. And I hope you'll stay on at the end because the Environment Agency is also kindly sponsoring a drinks reception downstairs. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Smith.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Matthew. There was a time about 4 months ago when I could only be introduced as either embattled or beleaguered. That time, fortunately, is now behind us. But we did have a very challenging time through the winter months here in the UK. I remember on one occasion I went on Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman. The flooding in both Somerset and the Thames Valley was in full flow. And his first question to me was, well then, who's to blame? To which I said, it's the weather, Jeremy. He was, I fear, unusually for Jeremy, falling into the blame game trap, which too much of our politics at the moment falls into, and too much of our media commentary falls into. But it was indeed the weather that was to blame, because during the period from the start of December through to the middle of March, we had a conveyor belt of extreme weather hitting the UK. It started with the biggest storm surge on the east coast that we have seen for 60 years, in many places higher than the tragic surge that affected the east coast in 1953. On Boston's stump, they carve marks of where the water gets to at successive flooding events. The mark for 2013 is considerably higher than the mark for 1953. So that was the start, the big storm surge. That was followed by huge storms over Christmas and New Year. That was followed by another set of high tides at the start of January, followed by the wettest January and February we've experienced for 250 years, accompanied by, on occasion, the biggest waves ever recorded hitting the south coast of England. And then, of course, the final twist in the tale, the levels of groundwater rising to unprecedented levels. That whole series gave us the wettest, the longest, the worst, the highest, the most difficult of a whole succession of weather events. The Thames Barrier, which when it was first opened, was raised on average at most once or twice a year. In the course of 3 months, was raised and lowered 50 times. This was exceptional weather. And we weren't alone around the world in experiencing exceptional weather. The east coast of the United States was experiencing the worst freeze that they've had in decades. The heart of Australia was melting. There were serious floods, and there have been serious floods across much of Europe. I think that we are indeed seeing the first impacts of climate change, because the science of climate change tells us very clearly that we are going to experience more extremes of weather, more floods, more droughts, more erratic and extreme weather patterns. And let's just remind ourselves of the climate change indicators around the world. Globally, each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer than any preceding decades since 1850, when reliable global records began. Also globally, May this year, 2014, was the hottest May on record. 13 of the warmest 14 years on record have all occurred in the 21st century. The only one of the 14 not in the 21st century was in fact in 1998. At the end of the summer of 2012, Arctic sea ice was at its lowest extent, only just over half the average lowest extent from 1979 to 2000. And over the last 2 decades, sea level rise has been around 3.2 millimeters per year, nearly twice the average rate from 1901 to 2010. Those are just a few of the signals of what's happening to our planet. The World Economic Forum has recently published a document setting out the 10 top global risks in their view. 4 of those top 10 global risks are climate-related. They include water crises, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, greater incidence of extreme weather events, and food crises. That's not Greenpeace, it's not Friends of the Earth, it's not campaigning green organizations. That is the World Economic Forum. The world of business, in fact, gets all of this much better than most politicians do. Increasingly, firms around the world are thinking about their preparedness for what climate change is likely to bring. They're looking at possible impacts on their supply chains. They're looking at the resilience of their suppliers, services, and indeed of their customers. They're thinking seriously about the energy, transport, and water use and costs that they have. And, crucially, they are understanding that doing things more greenly is also doing them more cheaply. Why then is the political world not taking this up more vigorously? Because they aren't. The environment is low down on the list of public issues for politics and for government. And I have to say, the government, despite some brave statements at the outset, they were going to be, remember, the greenest government ever, have done disappointingly little to live up to that ambition. The Green Deal, for example, has been a pale shadow of what it could have been if we were going to get serious as a country about energy efficiency. And the drive from Mr. Pickles and others against renewable energy, it does, I'm afraid, make me very disappointed. I have to be fair and to say that the opposition is not giving the environment very much of a push either. This is a failure across the whole of politics. So why this overall lack of interest from the politicians? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. The first is the opposition to climate change, or at least the opposition to the recognition of climate change. The climate skeptics are given far more credence in the public discourse and far more airtime than they really should. The overwhelming scientific consensus is that climate change is real and it's happening. The way in which anything that, for example, Lord Lawson or Lord Ridley say are pounced upon by the media and blown up into some sort of major statement, this is not sound science. You have only to look at what's happening in America with the attitudes of the Republican Party in its entirety and the attitudes of some of the Rust Belt state Democrats to see that climate skepticism is not something that is going to go away in a hurry. I say in the context of that, hurrah for Barack Obama and his recent decision to use the Environmental Protection Agency and his executive powers in order to make some progress on combating climate change. So that's one reason, the degree of and credence given to the opposition, to the skeptics. Second reason, we thought that the Climate Change Act had it sorted. It was a groundbreaking piece of legislation. It was a brilliant thing for the then Parliament, now some 6 years ago, to do. It went through, remember, with only 4 members of Parliament voting against it. It was a substantial bit of consensus lawmaking of its time. But we sort of then gave up. We thought, well, we put that on the statute book, and then as a country we didn't go on to do more. Legislation is only the start. It's action that has to follow. Third reason. Too often we portray climate change and its consequences as a nightmare. People don't like listening to nightmares. They don't want to believe in nightmares. They want to believe in hope. They want to believe in something different, something better. On the whole, voters vote for dreams, not for nightmares. So, in this whole field, there is hope. I'm going to come to that in a moment or two. But we need to be better at articulating the debates and discussion around climate change in that context. Fourth, there are some people who regard environmental concern generally, and climate change in particular, as something of a conspiracy of the elite, the chattering classes, the sophisticated, the upper middle classes, not sufficiently connected to all the people of the country. I think they're wrong on that, and I'll say in a moment why I think they're wrong. And there's the fifth point, which is linked to that. And that's that we don't make the environment and climate change real for people, mattering to their everyday lives and their everyday experience. We're too generalist in the way in which we talk about it. Mention the environment or climate change, and people's eyes tend to glaze over. But talk to them about their own little patch of environment, about the river at the bottom of their village, or about the landscape that surrounds where they live, or about the urban streetscape and the way in which it's fashioned. Talk to them about their bit of environment, and they become really passionate about it. They're committed to it. They worry about it. They hope for it. They know what they want to change. Now, the secret for politics is, can we link that passion for the local bits of environment with the general principles that have to surround it? The public are concerned about all of this. They're keen to see progress. and politicians should not think that the public don't care. In a way, I think, although voters don't see the environment as an overt national priority, I do think they see it as an underlying sine qua non, something that has to be looked after, that has to underpin everything else. They're aware of it. They know about that, and they don't want it not to be cared for. They may not tell the pollsters that it's top of their list, but they want to see it being looked after. So I said there is hope in all of this field. It's not just something about going to hell in a handcart if we're not careful. Where is the hope? Well, there are three bits of hope in particular. The first is that the environment has been improving over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. And by environment, I'm thinking about air and water quality and looking after our land. Part of that is down to the hard work of the Environment Agency. But look at the major successes. The reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions, something like 60-70% over 10 years. Reductions in nitrogen oxide levels. The reduction in numbers of pollution incidents in discharges to river. The improvement in water quality and in bathing water quality. The return of fish to rivers from the Thames to the Mersey. And now the fact that otters are in every single county in England, which could not have been said just a few years ago. We do have a cleaner, better place here in the UK, and we've done that through a mixture of action, hard work, regulation, and bringing pressure to bear on polluters. That's a success story. It's something that can be done. So in thinking about how we take the environment forward, and in particular how we tackle climate change, thinking about that success story and the combination of the regulatory, funding, action, pressure on polluters role that we've played, that's the secret. That's how we get to success in this. Second, there's a huge economic opportunity for us in environmental improvement and tackling climate change. Saving money on existing processes and products. That doing things more greenly, meaning doing them more cheaply, point that I made earlier on. But in addition to that, there are new products and services to be brought to market. Now, we're not terribly good at bringing new products to market in this country. We did a lot of the early research on wind power. We then allowed the Danes and the Germans to get ahead of us and make all the wind turbines. Let's not make the same mistake, for example, with tidal and wave power, where at the moment we lead the world in research. But let's not make the mistake of not then exploiting the opportunities that come. And third, there is a chance, I believe, for the UK to lead on all of this, to take a global role in something that is beginning to be picked up all around the world, even in some of the heavily polluting countries. So, what do we want from government and politics in relation to the environment going forward? Well, I've set out a 12-point plan of where I think government needs to go on this. And here it is. Number one, take on the skeptics and do it vigorously, vociferously, and all the time. Make the case. Don't yield assumptions to those who want to deny that climate change is real. I would say exactly the same about some other aspects of politics, actually. The response to UKIP should not be to try and out-UKIP UKIP. The response should be to take them on, to show why they're wrong. So, take on the skeptics, number one. Number two, don't give up on international negotiation. The other countries around the world are changing. Not just the progress in the United States with Obama, but look at China and the amount that China is now investing in wind power, in renewable energy. Yes, because of the nature of growth in China, their emissions are still going up. But they now have a cap in place for the next 15 years or so, and they are investing hugely in renewable and non-polluting energy sources. And they're doing it because they are getting worried about their environment, the air quality in their cities, the water that they're dependent on from the melting glaciers of the Himalayas. So there is scope out there for building alliances, for getting countries around the world to agree and do things together. So don't give up on the important process of trying to get international agreements in place. Third, bipartisanship is needed on this in the UK. This should not be a party political issue. Because it's so important, because it's so long-term, because we need to plan for the future, this is going to ride through government after government after government of all political persuasions. And the more that we can have consensus between political parties on this, the better. Number 4, maintain our commitment to Europe. Most of our environmental protection in this country comes in the form of European directives. Not all of them are brilliant. One or two of them are deeply flawed. But actually, the corpus of European legislation that governs our environment is good to have, it's essential, and it has produced a lot of that progress that I spoke about earlier on. And of course, environmental damage and destruction is no respecter of national boundaries. This is not something that we can simply do on our own. It's something that together as a continent we can do more. More is actually much more in this respect. Fifth, we should recognize that pollution and environmental detriment tend to harm the poorest in society first and most. This is why I believe passionately this is not an issue for comfortable elites. This is an issue for everyone. It's no accident that if you look at the poorer areas of virtually any city around the world, the poor districts are where the prevailing winds end up. The impact of poor environmental quality hits the rest. It's not just them and us. It is everyone that's in this. And the debate must be framed in those terms. Sixth, we have to get better at planning for uncertainty. We know that climate change is happening. We know where that climate change is taking us. What we don't know is precisely when the various impacts are going to happen. So what we've got to do is to prepare for those impacts, but then be able to change and adapt our policies and our decisions as we go forward according to what is actually happening on the ground. It's something we've done in the Environment Agency in the Thames Estuary 2100 programme. It looks at what is going to be needed over the course of the next 90 years in the outer Thames Estuary, beyond the barrier. And what it sets out is a series of scenarios that will occur depending on what degree of change we see. And it sets out the policy decisions that are needed at each stage, depending on what is actually seen to be happening on the ground. We need to get better at doing precisely that sort of thing in many other respects. Seventh, maintain investment in research and new initiatives. This is one of the most important contributions that any government can make. I mentioned earlier on wave and tidal power. I think I'm right in saying that of the 6 biggest demonstration projects in wave and tidal power around the world, 4 are here in the UK. We are an island surrounded by waves and tides. It is surely not beyond the wit of us as a nation to harness the power of those waves and tides in order to produce energy. Eighth, understand that regulation is important and a force for good. I despair at the way in which some politicians see an arbitrary abandonment of regulation as being somehow good, somehow lightening the burdens on the economy and business. Actually, yes, of course, we need smart regulation. We need regulation that respects the needs of business. But it's regulation that's driven a lot of the environmental improvement that we have seen in this country, and the abandonment of it would be a disaster. Arbitrary formulae like 1 in, 2 out don't help in ensuring the environmental protection that we need. Ninth, adaptation is every bit as important as mitigation. I hate these 2 words, adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation, of course, means trying to stop climate change happening in the first place by reducing the greenhouse gases that we produce, by ensuring that we're much more energy efficient, by reducing the carbon content of all our activity. Adaptation means trying to cope with the inevitable consequences of climate change. I fear that the world as a whole has probably already sold the pass on a 2-degree rise in overall temperature. The effects of climate change, even if, as a world, we stopped generating carbon dioxide tomorrow, and we're not going to do that, of course, even if we did that, the impact of climate change would carry on for another 30 years because there's such momentum built into the system. So we are going to see impacts of climate change, whether we like it or not. And as I said at the outset, I think we are already beginning to see some of those. We need to be prepared for that. We need, for example, when we're building flood defences, not to build them on the old assumptions because we thought, even 20 years ago, we built a flood defence. It was good for what in the jargon of the risk trade was a 1 in 100 year flooding event. Now that probably means a 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 year flooding event. The risk is getting greater, and we need to respond accordingly, and particularly in our preparedness as a nation for combating flood risk. 10th, we need to work with business in ensuring that we make as much progress as we can. Business is, as I mentioned, way ahead of us in all of this. They know absolutely what climate change is threatening. Talk to anyone in the insurance industry and they will absolutely tell you about climate change. Let's make sure that we harness the willingness of business to help on this. Let's use the talents, the ingenuity, the entrepreneurial possibilities that business will be able to give us. 11th, this is a bottom-up process. It will, I believe, be businesses, communities, inventors, individuals that bring progress in ensuring environmental protection, rather than necessarily governments doing it all. Actually, this is a lesson for the whole of our politics at the moment. It's especially true at a time of austerity. Governments cannot do everything on their own. We need to harness the power of communities and individuals within communities in order to secure progress. And in this field of environment, more than any other, that's, I believe, true. And 12th, a far stronger voice and commitment to the environment and to the reality of climate change from government. This is not just this government, it's all governments, it's all political parties. They all need to have a much stronger voice on this. It is reported that the Prime Minister dismissively talked at one point about all the green crap. Well, it isn't crap, and the green crap matters. And that should be written on every government desk. Overall, what I'm asking for is achieving a thoroughgoing re-greening of our politics and our public discourse. This is an issue that has faded from sight. It needs to be brought back in full and open view. It needs to be talked about, it needs to be recognized, it needs to be acknowledged, and we need to start doing things about it. This is something which really matters, I believe, to many, many people. It's not only a good thing to do in itself, a necessary thing to do in itself, but actually it's good politics. It will help to restore some of the respect that the political system has lost over the course of recent years. There's a wonderful poem by William Blake where he sort of sums up in a rather poetic way why all of this is important. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I don't normally respond well to people saying in their speeches, I have a 12-point plan, but that was intriguing and a very comprehensive account. So just 2 or 3 questions from me. The first is that it felt to me as though 2 or 3 years ago, there was almost a kind of benign feedback loop emerging between government intent and regulation, innovation, investment decisions, public attitudes. We seem to have got to a place where there was every chance of momentum increasing and us moving towards a different kind of way of thinking about the economy, and somehow that stopped. Why do you think that happened, and how do you, I know you've got your 12-point plan, but is there one thing that we could do to restart it?
I think it happened because, and you're right, it has happened. And I think it happened because the financial crisis occurred, the collapse of the banking systems around the world, the economy became the absolute overriding issue that everyone wanted to talk about, and most governments ran for cover. I think most parties in the UK ran for cover. They thought the only thing that matters is the economy, the environment, and regulation are distractions. They may even be counterproductive, they thought. I think they were wrong. And that just plunged it down the salience register. And I think that was the prime reason why that virtuous circle, which we thought we were seeing in place, suddenly just broke.
So does the economic recovery, such as it is that the grounds for hope?
I think it is a ground for hope. It's a very faltering economic recovery thus far. We hope it's going to speed up and get better. I think if I had to identify one area where I think it might be possible to get a bit of change in this virtuous circle going to vicious circle, is in the economic arguments for environmental protection and regulation and improvement, the opportunities that exist, the efficiencies that can be driven. And there are really good economic arguments for why all of this is useful economically. I think we just need to get that more readily understood.
Now, you spoke tonight, and you said the same thing when you spoke here last year, I think, which is this connection you want to make between people's own environment, between their love for the countryside, or I think you used the example of birds last year, and connecting that in a chain to a concern for the global environment. There's a similar kind of issue, it seems to me, about how do we think about small-scale interventions. There'll be probably people in this room who are involved in those small-scale interventions, energy efficiency, reducing people's car journeys, whatever it might be. Now, if you look at those interventions on their own, first of all, they don't have much impact, and secondly, they can sometimes have perverse outcomes because people save money on their energy bills and they spend it flying around the world or whatever. So you can get to the point of feeling that's all quite futile. On the other hand, the argument is, well, we need kind of radical system reform. You know, it's a kind of Green Party view. We have to completely revise what we think about the economy. We have to give up growth, etc. How do we think about change on those scales at the same time in a useful way?
There's a temptation to think, well, you know, what can I as a single individual do? If I recycle a bit more, if I do some energy efficiency, if I travel less, if I try and generate less carbon, what on earth is the use of that when China's building another coal-fired power station next week? But actually, if we all thought that, that way lies disaster. If we all thought rather more positively, yes, we can do a tiny bit, then it all adds up. If you look at what happened in Germany, for example, over the course of the 90s and the first 10 years of this century, the number of renewable energy initiatives that individual householders put into their property all over Germany, solar panels everywhere, wind turbines all over the place. There was a real surge. It was helped by feed-in tariffs, of course, but there was a real surge in individual effort to embrace renewable energy. That has made a big difference to Germany's overall carbon footprint. And it was millions of individuals doing their own thing. The other point I'd make about individual action in all of this is that individual action helps not just to make people feel good about themselves, but it helps to remind them all the time about why all of this is important. And that in itself is a good thing to have happening.
One final question for me, slightly more personal one, which is that you, of course, were a cabinet minister. Now, when you were a cabinet minister, you didn't really kind of practice the dark arts of spin. I mean, we tried to get you, but you you just wouldn't do it. But you had relationships with lots of quangos at DCMS. Then you're on the other side of the fence. You're in a quango, and you are subject yourself to those same slightly kind of murky briefing practices. What has it taught you about statecraft? Or its absence?
I suppose it's taught me that in all governments and in all parts of politics, there are some people who are entirely honourable, and there are others who will try and point fingers of blame, shift the focus onto someone else in order to have it away from them, and so on. Classic contrast under when we were going through the experience of the winter floods. Owen Paterson, the Secretary of State for the Environment, who is our sponsoring minister, was absolutely nothing but supportive through the whole of the flooding emergency. He was, of course, rushed into hospital with a detached retina for quite a significant part of that, but he was texting me from his hospital bed to say, I want you to say thank you to your staff from me because of what they're doing. Now, by contrast, Eric Pickles on the Andrew Marr programme said, I want to apologise to the people of Somerset. We took too much notice of the Environment Agency. We thought we were dealing with experts. And that was the point where I thought, I've had enough of this, and went into rather uncharacteristic counterattack mode. And within a day and a half, and one of the things I was saying was, yeah, quite all right for you to have a go at me. A chairman, to a certain extent, is supposed to be a punch bag. But I am absolutely not having you having a go at my staff, who've been working their socks off for the whole of the last 6 or 7 weeks. Now, within a day, Eric Pickles was in front of the House of Commons saying, I love the Environment Agency.
Great. OK, let's take a couple of rounds of questions, take 2 or 3 together. So let's start with the gentleman in front. If you could keep them short and sharp and tell us your name, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Lord Chris Smith, where in your 12-point plan is there a role for carbon tax, something that would help tilt the economy even more in favour of these green and renewable actions?
OK, carbon tax. And then there's a gentleman there in glasses.
Hello, you've talked about what we...
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, David Cotton. You've talked about what we in this country are doing, and I think we're probably doing quite a good job. How are we going to get world collaboration and cooperation? In particular, how are we going to get the Americans, the Canadians, and the Australians to participate? I mean, the Canadians have just pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, and the Americans have never ratified it at all. And anyway, the Kyoto Protocol targets weren't very strict anyway.
Thank you. And then there's a lady right at the back of the room.
Hi, my name's Harriet. I was just thinking what you were saying about business. It felt like you presented it somewhat as a monolith. I think that if you look at where climate skepticism, for example, is coming from, a lot of it is funded by businesses. For example, the Heartland Institute in the US, its major funding comes from, for example, the Koch oil brothers, things like that. So I wondered if you could comment on that, where the skepticism is coming from, and admitting that a lot of it is coming from business, regardless of some businesses also making progress, but and also what that means for the connections between politicians and business. Okay. Thanks.
So carbon tax is international cooperation, and are you being too rose-tinted about business?
Mm-hmm. The answer to the carbon tax question actually touches on the question about world cooperation, because the sensible way, a carbon tax would be a brilliant thing. It would be absolutely a sensible thing to do. but it's the sort of thing which is very difficult to do in one country. And you need to build a much broader base across the world. Now, you don't have to have it in absolutely every country. I suspect the gentleman who asked about international cooperation, Canada, who are just gung-ho for tar sands and the oil that comes from them at the moment, talk to any Western Canadian politician, and you just do not get a look in for thinking about the problems of climate change. So you're probably not going to get countries like Canada signing up to a carbon tax at the moment. But hey, let's start with Europe. Let's then see where we can go beyond the boundaries of Europe. I think this is something that needs to be pushed much more vigorously. But it's not going to happen in a hurry. It's going to take time to do. The world cooperation point I just referred to, the US is a really interesting case in point. Because the US political system is sort of broke at the moment. It is almost impossible to get anything done because the population as a whole are not by much, but they are significantly democratic in their leanings, something like 52 to 48%. It's almost certain that a Democrat will be elected president to follow Obama. But meanwhile, Congress is completely dominated by the Republicans because of the way in which boundaries have been drawn and gerrymandered. You are always going to get a sclerosis in American politics until that problem is sorted out. So getting progress on, for example, a carbon tax, which would require approval of Congress in the US, it's not going to happen in a hurry. Getting progress on lots of other things, as we've seen with Obama and the EPA, as we've seen in quite a lot of cities and states around the US, getting progress at smaller scales and smaller levels is actually moving ahead quite well. So there are some things you're not going to get in terms of world cooperation. There are other things you will. The question about business, you're absolutely right. It's not a monolith. There are businesses that, particularly in some of the polluting industries, are looking after what they see as their existing own interests. But there are lots of other businesses that are waking up to what can and should be done in this. Some really interesting work done by Price Waterhouse about a year and a half, 2 years ago, polling business leaders across a whole number of continents. Even in Russia, business leaders by a majority were saying that they felt that they needed to take climate change seriously in their business. So the picture is not all bleak, it's not all rosy. You're absolutely right to pull me up on that.
It's worth, although I would recommend to you, Chris, to read the article in the current RSA journal reporting Accenture's most recent study, which argues that actually business opinion has gone into reverse, and investor opinion too has gone into reverse in comparison to 2010. And there is a private pessimism amongst business leaders that they can do this without major government regulation. So it's interesting that this is moving around. Okay, let me take these three together. If you ask really short, sharp questions, we might get another round in as well. So there's 1, 2, 3. And then I shall turn to this side of the room.
Hi there, Jonathan Leake, I'm the environment editor from the Sunday Times. It's about the Green Deal. You were quite critical of it, Chris. I remember talking to Greg Barker long ago when he was promising to pretty much refurbish the whole nation's housing stock. And the rate so far is really pitiful. But what's your reasons for saying, why do you think it's failed, and what do you think it should have been, how should it have been structured to be better?
Great. And then behind you? Is there someone behind you? Yeah.
Good evening, Lord Smith. My name is Robert Chinero. I just wanted to ask a quick question on, do you think the public of Britain has been missold environmentalism and thinking it's just about, warmer summer's great, I'll get my flip-flops, or winter where it's more rain, great, I'll get my coat. And actually it's more important than that. And it's, especially for a country like ours, importing lots of food from abroad, we're not being told this full story of environmentalism and how it internationally impacts us locally. And I think as a second question is so little is discussed about the population of the global population and decreasing it. It's time to decrease the global population. I'm not talking about, mass euthanasia here, but, we do need to get the population down, and I think it's really important, and it's not discussed, and it's this, we can't talk about that. And it's one of the key factors for driving up global warming, is the amount of people we've got trying to do stuff in the, with stuff here. So, yeah.
Thank you. Got the point, yep. And then there's a gentleman back there. But don't cheat, just one question.
Thank you. It's actually a similar question. In the UK, have we been so successful at incremental improvements that we no longer have a mandate to make transformative change, because actually a lot of the impacts have been improving consistently, and a lot of the problems that we're going to face from climate change are essentially externalities to the people of the UK. They're going to occur between the tropics, in the developing world. We don't see, for example, what they have in China, where their main problems aren't carbon at all. It's air pollution, water pollution, and food problems.
So I'm going to interpret that as, why has the Green Deal been a disaster? Is there a danger of kind of complacency and parochialism in British attitudes? And do we need people to stop having babies?
First of all, on the Green Deal, Jonathan's question, massive disappointment. I think the reason is it's too complicated for people to make use of. And also it requires money up front. And the lesson of all energy efficiency programs that have worked, and there haven't been many of them, there's been initiative after initiative after initiative, and all of them tend to end up as damp squibs. There are some that have worked, and they've been run by local authorities. The most obvious and best known example is Kirklees, and they succeeded by making it easy for people. They went round, knocked on people's doors and said, here I am, I've come to have a look, talked with the householder about what needed to be done, and then said, I'll organise it for you. We'll come in and do it. And they took all the hassle out of it, and of course, take-up was massive. That's the only way in which I think you'll get a real energy efficiency programme off the ground. And using local authorities to do it might not be such a bad idea, actually. The global population issue, this is something that Professor David King constantly talks about. He's right, you're right. The size, the ever-expanding size of the global population is one of the major things that's driving environmental and climate change. Now, I wouldn't dream of advocating any sort of enforced restriction on population numbers. But what we do need to do is try and make sure, that's something you can only do if you're China and you are effectively a dictatorship. What we can do, however, is just try and make sure that the issue gets debated and discussed and talked about and people become aware of it, because that may help to change behaviour. I cling to the hope that one day the Catholic Church might try and assist in this issue as well.
That's the subject to open up with 4 minutes to go.
And the incremental improvements, transformative change point, you may be right. We have had incremental improvements in the UK. not so much in our approach to climate change, because we're not doing brilliantly against our 1990 figures on, for example, carbon dioxide emissions.
What about the other point that people naively think that climate change just means it's going to be a little bit warmer in July and a little bit less cold in December? You know?
There's still people who appear to believe that. And one of the culprits in all of this is the term global warming, which there are lots of people who think, oh, that would be a rather good idea. That's why I think increasingly we need to talk about these extreme weather patterns that we're seeing, and it does mean more cold and more baking and more dry and more wet, and it's going to intensify everything.
Now, I pride myself on finishing on time, but I am going to take one last set of questions, but they must be really short, and there's actually 3 people sitting together. Have you organised that? Is that kind of pre-planned? I'm very impressed. So we'll just go along the row.
Great, my name's Adam Woodhall. You mentioned about local authorities, and Woking Borough Council, over a 10-year period starting in the 1990s, reduced their carbon footprint by 80% in buildings. And I'm really intrigued why this hasn't spread like wildfire throughout the rest of the UK. So any comments on why, when it was so successful, it hasn't done better?
Britain isn't Woking. Yep, go on.
You've spoken before about Lucy Wills. You've spoken before about the importance of the public taking action. How do you feel, and feel free to comment either in your role or as an individual, how do you feel about the current fracking debate? Do you think that people should be actually taking a really active role in both in monitoring what goes on? Do we want citizen scientists to help?
And then finally,
Keith Pearce. How secure do you think the future of the Environment Agency is now in its present guise?
Okay.
I don't know why that question was applauded, but
first of all, Woking. I think when we are not good at seizing on good examples and then telling the story actively across the rest of the country. Where you've got brilliant examples like Woking and its own carbon footprint, like Kirklees and its energy efficiency programme, we ought to be shouting these from the rooftops. And we ought to have, dare I suggest, a Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government who was talking actively with local authorities about how they can follow some of these good examples. And that would help. Fracking. Fracking is actually, provided that, and this is a very, very important proviso, provided that it is properly regulated, fracking is a perfectly safe and acceptable form of getting a fossil fuel out of the ground. It remains a fossil fuel. So in my book, although burning gas is better than burning coal, considerably better than burning coal, it can and should be no more than an interim step from where we are now to the overall decarbonisation of our electricity production. But as an interim step, I think it's going to be quite useful. But, and I emphasise the but, it has to be properly regulated. And that means keeping the wells safe, no contamination of groundwater, proper looking after the waste residues from the fracking process, no methane being leaked out into the atmosphere, and so on. There are key things that need to be done. Provided those are done, it can be a safe process. Can local citizens assist in keeping an eye on things? Yes, absolutely. But there will be no substitute for the proper scientific analysis of what's happening and inspection of what's happening, which will, in large measure, be the duty of the Environment Agency. Which brings me neatly to the final question. I think the Environment Agency does have a secure future in its current form, partly because the things the Environment Agency does have to be done. They are necessary duties, and by and large, they do them rather well. And there's been some talk about, well, why don't you hive off flooding responsibilities into a separate body, and then everything else the Environment Agency does, pollution control, monitoring water quality and so on, all into a separate body. That would be a disaster. And it would be a disaster for one very simple reason. In the agency, we have about 3,000 members of staff whose job is labelled flood. They are the staff who work day in, day out on flood risk management and responding to flooding emergencies. When we had the emergencies over the winter, we had 4,500 staff working on the response to the flooding. Because what we were able to do was to draw in 1,500 staff from all the other parts of the agency who knew their patch, who knew the people, who'd received training, who knew what to do in emergency response in order to help the response to the flooding. Now, if you had a separate flooding agency, you would not be able to do that. So, yes, it's important to have it in its current shape, and I think it will be.
Great. And if you could have your time again, this is a one-word question. If you could have your time again, would you have taken on the Environment Agency role?
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. Okay, so thank you all for the questions that you've asked. As I said to you before, thanks to the beneficence of the aforementioned Environment Agency, who are our partners for tonight's event, there is a drinks reception downstairs in the Benjamin Franklin room, so please go down there and continue the conversation. But most of all, please join me, and I think not just thanking him for his contribution tonight, but thanking him for his role as Chair of the Environment Agency. Chris Smith.